I had multiple title choices for this video. I was going to just come right out and call it Gender Clinicians Are the Enemy, but I think I'll go with Gender Clinicians Are Not Our Friends for YouTube title reasons and search and censorship. I want to talk about these appalling quacks, these heedless, incurious, incompetent quacks, and the way that they have treated minors as lab rats, the way that they've disregarded concerns that are obvious, the way that they failed to predict problems that are obvious, the contempt that they have treated people who do have concerns over the last several years. There are now more people talking about this. More people should. It's quite shocking, really. Bill Maher had a segment on the downsides of pediatric medical transition on his show. So that's a start. He even talked about how Scandinavian countries are dialing back on this and the bone health issues and sexual health damage that this does to cognitively immature minors. More people should talk about it, though. Hopefully things are changing. I'm at Bitch, the Wing is on Fire. That's where I am. That's a quote from Whoopi Goldberg and a show that she did back when she was up and coming called Whoopi Goldberg Direct from Broadway. It's an amazing piece of work, really. She's actually a genius. I know some people make fun of her for being woke and stuff, but she's actually very talented. And this is a show we're seeing. But she has several characters. And one of the characters is Fontaine. And Fontaine is a sketchy drug addict with a heart who's also philosophical, who somehow finds himself in Amsterdam and is afraid of flying. And there's a segment about Fontaine's return home.
On the way home, it was kind of tense for me, because I happened to be looking out the motherfucking window. And I noticed that it was all black, and on the other side of the plane was all blue and shit. I said, there's something wrong with this picture. And I realized that the wing was smoking. So I said to the student, I didn't want to panic and nothing. I said, I beg your pardon. But it seemed as though the wing is smoking. She turned around and talked about, shh. I said, hey, bitch, the wing is on fire.
This is what these child castrating, Lupron and scalpel hugging quacks have been doing to cognitively immature youth. Here's the clip.
The second was an observation that I had that every single child or adolescent who was truly blocked at Tanner stage 2 has never experienced orgasm. I mean, it's really about zero. These are just assigned male at birth, so trans feminine, and it's because they never in their lives are exposed to testosterone. That doesn't change. So blockers prevent the rise of testosterone, and they don't really go on testosterone at or around surgery or into adulthood. And so we don't know. They're going to have this sensation. There's no question about that. But are they going to be able to achieve sexual satisfaction? It's important in relationships. And I know that from my work with female genital mutilation survivors, that the lack of being able to be intimate with a partner is very important. And so this is what really raised the red flag for me, is to say, look, we need to have our eyes open about it. I think it's been beneficial talking about it. I know Joe and many others have reported to me, they've changed their approach a little bit in their informed consent models, and that we're talking about masturbation now. We're talking about, okay, that's an area of the body that's got very dysphoric for you, but you know what? It's all a penis is just a large clitoris. I mean, it's all the same material. It really is. So use it for the pleasurable purposes, partially that it was intended, and we'll see what happens. But these are to be answered questions. So can we avoid puberty and get good adult results? And secondly, how do we assure someone that they're going to be able to be sexually responsive? Do we remove the blockers during the course of their adolescence? and let a little bit of puberty come back. Do we delay it a little bit? Maybe into Tanner's 3 or 4, maybe before they have their first orgasms, maybe.
Children at the crack of puberty cannot consent to this. This is going to be a consequence for the rest of their lives. These are medical impacts for the rest of their lives. And they didn't even experience a normal puberty. It is adults' responsibility to caretake cognitively, developmentally immature, growing people in order to protect them for their long-term benefit and mental and physical health. They cannot consent to this. I know they really want to transition. I know they really think that they want what they want. But as Helena, which is a fairly well-known detransitioner on the scene, likes to state, you have to treat the whole person. All of their long-term consequences, not just throw Lupron and scalpels at them. What have you done to these young people? They never even went through puberty, so they haven't even developed a normal sexual orientation to even know what it is. What have you done? People talk a lot about the infertility, and that is a big deal because there are trans people who have children and want biological children. There's studies who say that. They've sued governments due to being forced to be sterilized for their transition. But the sexual effects, that's not fixable. That's not coming back. You can't adopt that like you can adopt children. You can maybe be a foster parent. You can marry somebody else that has kids. That's it. At age 10 to 12? Really? Really? All the progressives and the Washington Post and the New York Times and the atheists and skeptics who I've been starting to criticize. Really? And given the fact that these young people are now sexually dead for the rest of their lives, how do they even know that some of these youths wouldn't have evolved out of gender dysphoria and come to accept themselves? They didn't even experience any kind of sexual orientation development because they had no hormones that were normal in their body. And if that is the case with some of them, as it very likely is, at least a few, how is that any different than sending girls from immigrant families in the United States off to West Africa for female genital mutilation, which is something that's illegal in this country? Why? Because the little sissy boy didn't make the right decision when he was 11? Is it any worse? Why? Yeah, I'm at Bitch the Wing is on Fire, and these gender clinicians are still like the tortoise. They should be coming out and calling for an outright ban on the use of puberty blockers in tweens. Male tweens at the very least, right now. These Dr. Frankenstein ghouls could have predicted this back in 2008 because it is in a paper by the Dutch clinicians who are the ones who started this child sex change, quote unquote, protocol. Here's a quote from Top Trans Doctors Blow the Whistle on Sloppy Care on Barry Weiss's Substack by Abigail Schreier, interviewing Erica Anderson and Marcy Bowers, both who are trans. Another problem created by puberty blockers / experts prefer blockade to blockage was lack of tissue, which Dutch researchers noted back in 2008. At the time, Cohen-Katinas and other researchers noted in natal males, early blockade might lead to non-normal pubertal phallic growth, meaning that the genital tissue available for vaginoplasty may be less than optimal. And yeah, obviously it messes with their sexual function in their brain. I wonder why they call it blockade. Because they're blocking the enemy, the attacking natural puberty. And they need to mount a military blockade. Is that why they're using that word? Well, they blockaded their future ability to have an actual adult, fully realized romantic relationship. I first knew of this effect maybe in 2018. That was still several years ago, as scores and scores more young people have been put through this protocol. We know this happened to Jazz Jennings, whose experimental vaginoplasty fell apart, and it was necessary to have multiple surgeries that were experimental. That young person has no sexual function, is obese, and depressed at this point. We know that. Good thing, though, that Marcy Bowers got to practice on this individual to make sure that it gets better for future young people. I think I need to put in a disclaimer here right now that I don't know of particular complaints against these individuals or legal complaints, but this is common sense. So calling them negligent and criminally negligent, this is my opinion. It's a well-educated one. There is really no justification for doing this protocol at such early ages, and they're not stopping it. WPATH isn't stopping it. You know, it sounds like there's murmurings about changing guidelines, but they should be calling for a ban on this, on males at least. I see, parents and professionals on social media continuing to tout this as of a couple days ago as safe and reversible. It's completely unethical. This is just absolutely unbelievable that this is even happening and that people are not screaming about this more. What are they going to do? Is like send out the Pony Express to get the fucking message out? I try to avoid swearing, but I might on this because I'm really pissed. Send out the Pony Express to send out the fucking message that you're completely sexually lobotomizing children based on a 10-year-old's decision. And, there are Facebook mommies, there's like 8,000 of them. They're going to be putting their male children on hormone blockers today, tomorrow, and the next day. That's what's going to happen. The only justification for doing this, the only one, would be if they had some kind of life-threatening illness. I'm going to grab that and start the video again. Actually, I'll just grab it now. I'm pissed. I'm animated. I don't care. My videos are normally very dry and informational. But screw this situation. The only justification for doing this is a life-threatening situation. You don't completely sexually lobotomize a person unless it's something that serious. The suicide narrative that they constantly push to justify this extreme medicalization of very, very young people is weak sauce. It is very weak sauce, which is kind of a weird term. I think there's other ways you could say that. I don't know. Lazy gravy. Lazy gravy. It's lazy gravy. It's tofurkey loaf. Whatever you want to say. Suicide is a very, very strong concern that everybody should have. But when you look at gender clinic data, there's not a lot of suicides that happen. The ones that they've noted are not really related necessarily to the medical access. There's been multiple suicides of young people after they had full affirmation and access to the medical protocols they supposedly want. That's the only justification for sexually lobotomizing a child who's making that decision at age 10 to 12 years old in Tanner 2. John Money was a creepy psychologist, I believe. Maybe he was a psychiatrist. Psychologist. Who suggested a boy named David Reimer, who had his penis cut off in a circumcision accident, be raised as a girl. And it was a very creepy experiment. John Money was a very creepy guy. He would have David Reimer and his sibling act out weird sexual things. Definitely a sociopath. That person wound up killing himself. That was one person with damaged genitals. What about even a 5% false positive rate of effeminate gay boys who are put through this protocol, whose sex organs will be ruined? It fucking dwarfs that incident. It dwarfs the number of intersex babies who had their genitals destroyed because doctors had to make them look quote-unquote normal. And why is it less bad? Because it's just some little sissy faggot kid at age 11? And who cares if we medically deface him because it's all part of the rainbow family. Because we're queering children. We're queering children and telling them there are dozens of genders, and it's just a gender journey. Really, that's what Diane Aronsaf calls this. A potential mistake on a decision made as a tween that removes healthy body parts and sterilizes and destroys romantic ability. A gender journey. Yeah. I'm going to walk you through why, if you think these people give a shit about the damage they're doing, why you're wrong. I started medical watchdogging this in 2015. I wanted there to be peace between the gay and lesbian community and the trans community. I was fully supportive of trans rights and whatever their demands would be, I thought would be reasonable. So I started looking into this, and I only became more and more alarmed at the complete apathy about what could go wrong that I saw amongst these people. I am going to go into more specific details about some of the individuals like Christina Olson, Joanna Olson Kennedy, Diane Aronsaf, Jack Turbin, a few other ones. And I know it sounds extreme to say that, but I found no evidence that they really give a shit about the harm that they can do, the extreme harm. Let's give some notes about what it is that they do to downplay the dangers of this, to push this radical agenda, to service their Messiah and God complex boners. I know some of them want to do good, but trust me, there's some very big egos and motivated reasoning in this field. And there's a few sociopaths, too, here and there, outright sociopaths, mostly the surgeons. Let me give several examples of how they hide intentionally the dangers and risks of what they're doing, because the collateral damage is worth it to them. And they've already decided this, and they want you to think that as well. This is what they do. They overemphasize the validity of the claim that gender identity, a specific gender identity, is innate and unchangeable, particularly in children and teens. They lie and downplay desistance, which is the youth who are likely to outgrow gender dysphoria. They falsely state they know that social transitions are fully reversible. They falsely state that hormone blockers are fully reversible. They manipulate the public and parents with suicide terror. They do and promote terrible studies. They have a smug contempt for people who are raising very legitimate concerns and poo-poo and dismiss them. And then they get to involve themselves in circular reasoning. First, innate gender identity. I want to talk about Paul Vassi and his research on third gender cultures in Samoa and southern Mexico. That's where he focuses, but he knows about other ones. He has stated that in those cultures, they don't believe that effeminate males are literally women. They have other ways of handling that, where those individuals are quite integrated into their societies. So in Samoa, you're not going to hear a fa'afafine say, I am a woman. They identify as fa'afafine. The idea that trans girls are girls is not universally culturally accepted across different areas where they may or may not be kind towards effeminate males. Innate gender, and the way that they push that, is a specious claim. What is innate is that young people are very, very feminine or masculine, and if they happen to be a feminine male or a very masculine girl, that causes obvious issues in social contexts. And there's different ways to handle that culturally. And if you think that culture doesn't influence gender dysphoria, you're wrong. And there are other environmental factors that influence gender dysphoria. There's another interesting article you can read in The World about the Khwaja Sira in Pakistan. What that says about the third gender males there is that they are simultaneously celebrated as gifted by God and ridiculed for not conforming to the male-female gender roles that society prescribes. It sounds a little bit like the Hijra in India. Somebody named Bindya Rana was commenting on a supermodel who has become famous from Pakistan, where they're pushing the more modernized view of trans women or women. And this person says, if you don't have a guru, we don't recognize you. These people who say they are transgender, that concept is just wrong, says one of Rana's Chilas. They can never be women. They cannot give birth. Even if they change their bodies, they can't change who they are. We are not women. We are what Allah has made. Innate gender identity is a cultural construct, really, in reality. Other social factors that influence gender dysphoria, we know that parents can, because adoptees have high rates of gender dysphoria. Foster kids have higher rates of gender dysphoria. There is one study that shows mothers with borderline personality disorder are overrepresented with boys that are sent to gender clinics. Homophobic bullying. There's other things that contribute to gender dysphoria. They do want to maximize all of these environmental factors in order to addict as many people as possible, young people, to roids and plastic surgery. That is what is going on. And that's what they want. They seem quite happy and mirthful about that. Because when a flayed genital is just as good an outcome as one that isn't, why not? Number 2, they lie and downplay desistance. The desistance research is there. You can find it. It involves multiple studies. The stat I like to use is 67%, taken from Drummond, Wallen, Cohen-Katinas, Singh, and Steensma. 67% desistance of DSM positive. That means you have to at least have some level of distress around your gender. Let's remind ourselves, Dr. Wren, I've said this in other videos, because I talk about this a lot. She's from the Tavistock Clinic. In a Guardian quote, she says, the younger ones can really, really want to be girls or boys. And then they can give that up, and their relationship to their bodies can settle down quite comfortably. If we can help some of those young people through adolescence, they might make a different choice later. Not when they're chemically castrated at age 11. That's doubtful, isn't it? In Corte, 2008, they talk about worrying about tracking pre-homosexuals into medicalization. Another study, early medical treatment of children and adolescents with gender dysphoria, an empirical ethical study. One therapist says, I have met gay women who identify as women who would certainly have been diagnosed gender dysphoric as children, but who throughout adolescence came to accept themselves. This might not have happened on puberty blockers. Comments from other gender clinicians say the same thing. They do everything they can to promote the true trans narrative. There are children that are consistently dysphoric, but they intentionally downplay the ones where that is not the case in order to elevate that narrative, to give that young person a clear path to very early medical treatments, starting at age maybe 9 for a girl and 10 for a boy. There's another thing they push that I've heard called the gender clinic myth. I've heard Dr. Ken Zucker say that. They like to state that once they hit adolescence, if they're still cross-sex identified, they're definitely going to be trans. I don't think there's hard evidence for that. Even Ray Blanchard has called that into question. Ken Zucker has said that's not necessarily true, and Ray Blanchard has probably said that, and I'll put up a little screen cap of him saying that, because he treated adults, and adults would change their mind. Not all the adults that would go through the clinic would necessarily transition, but all the little true trans kids are. Come on. But when you don't care, who cares? Michelle Forcier, pediatrics at Brown University. In an interview to NBC, kids rarely change their minds about their gender identity. Really, Dr. Forcier? Note that she's now a she/they. A grown-ass woman in her 40s or 50s is a they. Not a Tumblr person, not a Tumblr kid. Almost in old age, they, them. Joanna Olson Kennedy from Children's Hospital. Kids do roll through a lot of things as they go through identity formation, but our gender is a core part of who we are, and we actually all know what our gender is and have pretty solid gender identity. By the age of 3 or 4 years old, we all know our gender identity. And desistance is transphobic. You'll hear Diane Ehrensaft promote that message about how it's value-laden, quote unquote. Again, because a broken endocrine system with dependency on the medical industry is just as good an outcome as an adapted person with a healthy, intact endocrine system. Dr. Joshua Safer, Endocrinology Fellowship Training Program Director. He doesn't believe that there should be any cutoff. Ages are arbitrary. So, micropenis, anorgasmia, sterility, bone injuries, probable IQ effects if you look at the research. No reason to wait amongst these people. I see these people as coming home at the end of the day and disrobing from their suits or their they-them power outfits and rolling around naked on a bed of Lupron bottles and syringes and scalpels rapturously. Are you seeing that too? Can't you see that? I'm like getting a psychic premonition. I think it's real. I'm an atheist that doesn't believe in woo-woo, but I'm just getting a special vision. They also don't bother reading the research. Michelle Angelo identifies as a lesbian. I've heard her on audio multiple times at gender conferences. And there's somebody else named Elisa Bowman in an article by Think Progress by Zach Ford. He's kind of the American Owen Jones, which I think more people know about pediatric medical transition and the desistance, them trying to debunk desistance. Michelle Angelo and Elisa Bowman explain why this assumption is so misguided. They might have switched doctors, moved, or worse, committed suicide. Also, it's common for transgender people to express their true gender, face an abundance of, oppression, and, go in the closet. That's not what happened in the Steensma study if you read it. They followed up with them. They were not dysphoric. Jesse Singal wrote an article about that. The problem is Angelo Bowman, and then all these other people, and unfortunately myself, because he was confused at one point. We were all wrong, completely wrong. Steensma and his colleagues never simply assumed those 80 kids had desisted. They got in touch with most of them. And true to that assumption, they weren't dysphoric. They don't even read. Michelle Angelo is advising parents with little kids in therapy sessions to go on hormone blockers. She doesn't read the fucking research before recommending probably that they go to a doctor for a Lupron implant or injection. This is reckless. There's a whole paper by Temple, who I think is trans-identified, so no surprise there, called The Myth of Desistance. All of these false accusations are put in that paper. Joanna Olson-Kennedy appears to downplay desistance in a Q&A for professionals, and I'll read this quote. This is Gender Odyssey 2017. But unfortunately, it's important to recognize in that data, all of the people that were studied were prepubertal. This is previous data. They were children. We were only talking about pretty much children. Boys who wanted to look like girls or act like girls, play with girls' things, and wear clothes that girls would wear. Blah, 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 blah. That's what she says. So she's just waving it away. There's more audio on there where she's just saying, a lot of them were just boys who liked pink. That's not true. Some of them had DSM diagnoses. We know that some are even dysphoric about their genitals. So she's blah, 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 blahing all of that important information to hand wave it away. Because it's only chemically castrating children that we're talking about here. There's a post-millennial article. It was taken down, I think, because they rearranged some of their site. But it's a known researcher named Singh. I think it's pronounced S-I-N-G-H. Credulous establishment figures have bought into this narrative, which is now firmly ensconced in our educational, medical, social services, and legal institutions. Yes, it is. And the Democratic Party. The reality is, however, that there is no credible evidence that the affirmative approach is effective or safe. A key construct in accepting interventions in medical practice today, nor is there a scientific marker for a true, quote-unquote, trans or for a desister, as was noted in the BBC documentary by GIC researcher Dr. Devita Singh, in a study of over 100 boys who attended the GIC. 88 desisted post-puberty, even though their childhood certainty had been as intense as those who persisted. Blah, 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 blah. That's just blah, 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 blah. To Joanna Olson Kennedy. It's just little, flippancy about these little baby fags. It's all in the rainbow family. We're queering children. All right. If a pro-healthy puberty witch put some kind of curse on these individuals who are responsible for destroying the sexual function of all of these Tanner 2 males, which could be anywhere from in the high hundreds for sure to 3,000 individuals at this point, just based on all of the hundreds of gender clinics popping up and Facebook parents. So some witch put a curse on them where they could never have any sexual satisfaction again. It wouldn't be any more immoral than what they've done to any young person who may have just been gay and needed time to grow up, or even a trans person that may want an active, satisfying sex life. It wouldn't be any worse. Blah, 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 blah. Really angry. These people are not our friends. Actually, they're the enemy. Gender clinicians are the enemy. Number 3, social transitions are reversible. Total hogwash. They have no idea without a control group. These are PhD psychologists trained in developmental psychology, certainly, who are saying this. Young kids think in very simplistic, stereotypical terms. There's lots of research on that. They see somebody in a dress and they say girl, or somebody with a short hair and say boy, because that's what they see reinforced from an early age, and they think in very simple terms. Here's a quote by Professor Katie Alcock in a post on Medium called Young Children, Reality, Sex, and Gender. Children know what they like when society and the world tells them that the things they like are those that boys like, but they have been told in words that they are a girl. Well, that's easy. They already know that having short hair makes you into a boy. They know that playing with cars makes you into a boy. So it's easy. Boy all the way. And their version of the world at their age means that changing sex is totally possible. Do you see the potential for confusion and abuse here? Blah, 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 blah. Joanna Olson Kennedy. Gender Journey, Diane Ehrensaft. A quote from Desisting and Persisting Gender Dysphoria After Childhood, a qualitative follow-up study review. There were no differences in childhood behavior between the group that lost their gender dysphoria and the group they did not. But putting them in a social transition at 4, that's not going to possibly confuse them. So they only live from 4 to 11 and then just pop out of their cross-sex identification after years of social reinforcement. Bullshit. That we're not supposed to worry about that. Ken Zucker's predicted that is going to increase persistence. Other ones have. And certainly all of the youth, almost all of them, about 95%, are persisting in Christina Olson's study, no relation to Johanna. None of them are desisting now in her study, Gender Identity 5 Years After Social Transition. Quote, Joanna Olson Kennedy, social transition is a reversible intervention. The AAP says this. Christina Olson has said this. The American Psychological Association, all of these major organizations, they're making claims. They have no idea if this is true. You'd have to have a control group. But control groups are unethical. But butchering proto-gay kids is not. So we don't need to know. I know there's ethics protocols involved in withholding or giving certain treatments. But I think it's very clear who the acceptable sacrifices are here. Ayanna Scherer, I think she's a doctor. Dr. Jennifer Hastings, Michelle Forcier, Diane Arnsap, they all say this. Steensma talks about the need for watchful waiting, which is not the early social reinforcement. So it's not universally agreed upon, even though everybody's adopted and pushed this narrative. Number 4, hormone blockers, reversible. That's what they say. And they also downplay the other medical side effects like vaginal atrophy, stroke, other issues that they're going to have down the road, impacts on maybe babies if they don't get a hysterectomy. None of this is important to them. Hormone blockers are reversible. That's what I'd call the Blarney logical fallacy. There's multiple logical fallacies involved in making that claim, that unsubstantiated claim. Blarney logical fallacy isn't a real thing. I'm just using it as an umbrella term for the multiple failure of rational thinking in stating that. Puberty is obviously a very developmentally important time. I have quotes about that in other videos that I've done. You can refer to those. The titles will be obvious. I want to put people who have said that now through the walk of shame, particularly all the individuals on that Zoom call whose faces you can see. And names need to be named. The Dutch have even said just hormone blockers are just safe and reversible. The Pediatric Endocrine Society has made those claims. The Endocrine Society, somebody named Daniel Metzger, Norman Spack, Laura Cooper, Mitch Calloway. Name names of these people. These child sterilizers and sexual lobotomizers. Arthur Kaplan, endocrinologist Christopher Hook and Peter A. Lee, Joanne Olson Kennedy, Dr. Michelle Forcier. Here she is. The risk of not giving puberty blockers and the harm for continued development in the wrong gender far outweighs the minimal risks of totally reversible blockers. The voices in her head tell her that. So it must be true. So this grown-ass she/they pulled that out of she/they's anus. And I wonder how she/they's, they/them's anuses are different than a her anus or a him anus. I'm sure maybe it charts out confetti and glitter. Maybe that's how it's different. Seriously, she's cherry-picking research about high suicide rates and the Pulse survey about parental support. It was way too soon at the time of that quote for her to say that. As now we have a wider and wider trail of damaged young people. People in their teens who are already getting their double mastectomies, destroyed sexual function, micropenis, other issues. She's certain, though, even though the suicide threat is actually being trumped up and exaggerated. Not that it's not a concern, it is. When you deny that all of those factors and risks and dangers are important, it just makes it super easy for you to ruin kids' sex organs so they don't have to have an Adam's apple, while you get to feel like a real social justice warrior and the good guy and the savior. I'm sorry, the good they. And the savior X. Saviex. Sorry, my chair is creaking. So I'm shaking because I'm mad. They also like to lie and say that they know that hormone blockers help the young person to decide if transition is right for them. They have no clue if that is true or not when you are clusterfucking their puberty. No clue. Maybe the hormones that are central to puberty happening are actually important to the personhood. Of course they are. Robert Garofalo, that's really what these pubertal blockers do. They allow these families the opportunity to hit a pause button to prevent natal puberty until we know that that's either the right or wrong decision for that particular child. Dr. C. Rosenthal, it gives them more time to understand who they are without the clock ticking. Really, the clock's not ticking. The clock always ticks. And GnRA agents have been used for many years and have been found to be very effective and specific for blocking puberty in a completely reversible manner. I want to go back to the point that they don't really care enough about who they could hurt to bother asking even the most basic and common sense of questions, something a freshman with a half-wit IQ would think to ask. This is why I'm so contemptuous of these people. I understand gender dysphoria is serious, and these young people are screaming for what they want, and they're banging on the table, and they're self-harming. I understand all of that. But to just wave away all of this very, very, very serious things that we need to consider. Again, let's remind ourselves that there's a very high rate with persistence once you go on blockers, and the medical damage that we now know they have done. Also, bone injuries, serious bone injuries, including malformed spine, osteopenia. Number 5, suicide manipulation. Here is Dr. Wallace Wong coming out and just saying it. Thank you for your truthfulness. Thank you for not sugarcoating your language or hiding it or double speaking. This is what he says. He's in British Columbia. This is what he tells young people. So what you need is, you know what? Pull a stunt. Suicide. Every time. Then they will give you what you need, Wong said, adding that gender dysphoric kids learn that. They learn it very fast. Yes, they do. They're on social media learning to say they're going to kill themselves unless they get what they want immediately. That was on SOTT.net. You can read that quote. Thank you for your truthfulness about just how manipulative you people are. Dr. Deanna Adkins, affirmative model advocate, who was in on that call with Marcy Bowers about how they're making all these young people sexually dead. She was on that call. She's from Duke. In an article, Duke Open Center for Transgender Adolescents. This is almost more deadly than anything else I treat. Yeah, the suicide rates are high. And you need to look at other studies like Dana and Brandstrom that indicate that that doesn't change after medical transition. Did you consider that? No, you just made all kinds of hasty assumptions that were not founded on evidence. You're supposed to be rooting what you're doing in science, especially when you're sterilizing minors. Norman Spack has pushed that too. You can definitely see the saviorism complex. I know it's sincere, and some people, they do want to help. They don't want trans people committing suicide. As I've said, some of them truly do have Messiah and God complexes. And the scariest ones are the ones that have both. I think Joanna Olsen Kennedy is an example of that. Again, suicide is actually quite rare in the adolescents coming to these gender clinicians, but more above average in the same way that anxiety or depressed young people would be experiencing that. Michael Biggs in the UK has also looked at that as well. They all push this. Diane Ehrensaft especially, she really does it. Number 6, another thing they do is they do terrible studies and then they promote the heck out of those studies. Most of the old studies are on adult transitioners. They have very low regret rates. They show people reporting a reduced amount of gender dysphoria and often depression and anxiety. This is why I don't come out and say this should all be stopped. This is just a mental illness. People should be prevented from this. I don't see how I could stop it under a libertarian principle where there's other people that get to access plastic surgery procedures that they want. What's another story is whether or not the public should be funding this with insurance or public money like Medicaid, and I say no to that. And also destroying sex-segregated spaces. I say no to that. Anyway, low regret rates, there's no smoking gun for that. That's the problem with the adult studies and trying to stop this on kids. It's probably their strongest argument. Some of this really needs regulation, though, man. Phalloplasty is a true ghoulish Dr. Frankenstein horror show. It just is. And it just shows the severity of the mental disturbance of people who do that to themselves. The aesthetic results are horrible. It's put people in colostomy bags. People have almost died. The complication rate is astronomical. Anyway, back to these bad studies. The studies are not great. Huge loss to follow-up, so it's really difficult to track true regret rates. The medical costs are not really factored in the discussion of discussing whether or not we should do this at all. There's just problems with the studies. But let's talk about some really specific ones that we know for sure are bad. First, Brandstrom. This was a study done on the Swedish public healthcare system data. It was touted as a wonderful reduction in suicide risk with medical transition, with surgeries and cross-sex hormones. Guess what? It had to be retracted because when people who are actually serious about this looked at the study, they found the data proved no such thing. The conclusion had to be retracted. The fact that this study on public health care data showed no benefit in suicide risk reduction or mental health benefit to medical transition, you might want to think about that. The pro-child castration or even teen castration sterilization crowd. You might want to consider that, or even young adult, pro-young adult sterilization, medicalization crowd. All of you, progressive people, social justice warriors, quoke, that's my queer woke term, quoke atheists and skeptics who do crap work every time you talk about this. You might want to consider that study when you put thousands of kids on drugs used to chemically castrate pedophiles. There's another researcher, Jack Turbin. He's a psychiatrist, probably newly all credentialed young guy. He's just a media darling. Jack Turbin is just loved media darling. He does really crap studies, and his social media feed on Twitter is full on social justice warrior, and he blocks anybody that challenges him in reasonable ways. He grabs most of his data for the studies that he's done that are high profile are taken from the USTS. It's a trans study, a convenience sample done in the United States. And he had a study called Association Between Recalled Exposure to Gender Identity Conversion Efforts and Psychological Distress and Suicide Attempts Among Transgender Adults. This was cited by the United Nations. Yay! Crapidemia, cited by the United Nations. It's just another example of the crisis of competency that's going on in multiple ways right now. There was a letter to the editor in Archives of Sexual Behavior that critiques Turbin's bad study, and they list the reasons why it's bad as a biased sample, invalid measure of gender identity conversion therapy, misrepresentation of a key scale, omission of a key control variable, internal inconsistencies in mental health measures, claim of causation with only an association has been found. There's more problems with a puberty blocker study that he did. It even seemed like suspicious that the people that said they could access them even could at the time of this survey study. Some of it seemed pretty ridiculous to me when I read it, but I'll put in some critiques by a science documentarian called Malcolm Clark from the UK. There's a good thread that he put out on this, and Oxford professor Michael Biggs. You can access that there. Tordoff is a study by a researcher in child sex change, quote-unquote, Posse Seattle. Glowing, warm, fuzzy results from a study on giving puberty blockers to minors. She's out of the UW. The good news was spread throughout the land. Fake news. It's a bad study. I'm sure all of that good news isn't being retracted in any of the outlets that reported it. Jesse Singal has an article on that called Researchers Found Puberty Blockers and Hormones Didn't Improve Trans Kids' Mental Health at Their Clinic. Then they published a study claiming the opposite. Too bad it was circulated everywhere. It's irrelevant. They don't care. They don't care that it's wrong. They don't care that their studies are misinforming people. They have an agenda. They're child castration justice warriors, and whatever trail of damage is irrelevant to them. That's all. That's all that matters to them. That's how they behave. They don't correct their mistakes. They don't admit their mistakes. They do sloppy studies. They downplay desistance. They downplay the risks of social transitions. This is what they do. I bet Tordoff is not going to own up to this. Number 7, they detest anyone with concerns. I mean, they hate their guts. I've seen these people. I've been watching them for years. They have nothing but smug contempt for anyone who raises perfectly logical, perfectly reasonable concerns. And now we know concerns that turned out to be right. I'm going to provide an example of that. How it just doesn't matter to them, because when the children who you're going to medically deface and sterilize, it's just morally acceptable collateral damage. Why not? Why not link arms across America to make sure nobody stops giving children drugs that destroy their fertility and sexual health? So they look like a girly face. All right, so check out what these motherfuckers did. Several mental health and medical professionals put together a website called the Gender Dysphoria Working Group. And it has very legitimate people you might know of if you follow this issue. Diana Kenny, Susan Bradley was in this group, Michael Bailey, who's an expert in trans people and research around that, Sasha Ayad, Lisa Marciano. So they formed this group, the Gender Dysphoria Working Group, because they were alarmed about what was going on with medicalizing young people so young, pretending that no one could ever outgrow this and what the potential medical damage could be. And they were also noticing more and more instances of regret, like real world cases of regret. So they put this group together. Then, several months later, these quacks, these arrogant God and Messiah complexes, put up another webpage. It has a very similar look and feel. And guess what these bastards called it? The Gender Dysphoria Affirmation Working Group. They trolled them. They trolled the people that wanted to put together a legitimate discussion about the risks and harms, or maybe even benefits. And they put up their own little agenda to troll them. Who does that? What normal person does that? What serious person does that? What person who gives two shits about the pre-gay and lesbian kids shown to possibly outgrow this do that? Or the increasing number of teenagers with complex mental health conditions? Trolls. People concerned about that. Who does that? People with cluster B personality disorders do that. That's who does that. And some of the activists they're associating themselves with are legit sketchy. Like really like sexually shady, have really weird quotes and stuff. I'll leave a link to that. You can look for yourselves. So now, after all of these quack bastards that troll legitimate concerns, what they get to do is take over all of the medical bodies in pretty small committees, and then they write the guidelines and the public statements for major entities like the Endocrine Society and the Pediatric Endocrine Society. So then they get to go back and point to their own bullshit. You know, and it's not all bullshit. There's young people with stable cross-sex identifications. There are young people who are very, very distressed. They are absolutely sweeping the damage under the rug, and they're doing it on purpose because they don't care. They don't want you to either. Here's a quote from an article I did on Christina Olson of the Trans Youth Project. In a piece she did for Scientific American, she pulls this crap. What Christina Olson fails to mention is that the guidelines for all these organizations are being written by people like her, who omit or de-emphasize very relevant information like desistance statistics or severe medical side effects, who then get to point back to these medical body statements and say, see, I'm right. All the important people agree with me. This is exactly what they do. All right. All this reckless endangerment, it's completely intentional because it's so small, it's so insignificant to the beautiful, loving affirmation, the unicorns and the rainbows, and all the love of gender diversity and the dozens of genders, and having them have a pretty passing girl face so they'll be happy and not be suicidal. This is all worth sacrificing a few sister kids to being sexually dead, having harm bones, They just know that even though all these trans people have kids and play on sports teams, that for a pretty femi doll face, they're going to want to sacrifice their bone health and their ability to have children. They're just sure, and they're going to act with smuggery and contempt for anybody else that raises questions. That's what they do. And they're now controlling all of the major institutions, the media, universities, everywhere. And I want to ask the quote, gays and lesbians who love all this, who just love all of the LGBTQ plus rhetoric and activism and media campaigns. Do you really want to trust the oopsie, we sexually lobotomized a bunch of young people, maybe that was bad people? You want to trust them? You really want to trust the child genital ruiners? Is that who you want to trust to properly identify what kid is a pre-gay or lesbian kid and what kid is a quote-unquote true trans or a persister or whatever who may indeed want to transition? But you're going to trust them? All the people that have been telling us, even somebody like Laura Edwards-Leeper, who is now alarmed about what's going on, or Eric Anderson, they're going to want to go back to saying, oh, we need better assessment. These are also the same people who did not consider these very, very serious side effects that it was obvious that somebody should worry about. You want to trust them? Quote, gays and lesbians and bis, all the bi-pan queers, who love this stuff. You're going to trust them for your trans allyship, to perform your trans allyship. You're just going to medically deface a few of these kids for the rest of their lives. Bodies harmed the rest of their lives. Breasts missing the rest of their lives. Sex organs non-functional the rest of their lives. With even a 5% false positive rate being scores of children that will dwarf some of these other medical fad harms in the numbers of young people it's going to impact. And the numbers it already has in just instituting this in a millisecond in time. Thank you for listening to my rant. I am extremely upset. I am very upset that this is going to be done to more young people tomorrow based on totally flimsy evidence. There's not justification that all these long-term consequences are worth it and that a 10-year-old can know this. I'm going to do another video zeroing in more specifically on the kooky and zany behavior of a few of these other people like Diane Ehrensaft and Joanna Olsen-Kennedy, Christina Olsen, a few of the other ones. Thank you for listening. Sorry for the swearing, but I just wanted to be my true self today.